Javier. Michelle stood at the doorway of the small, quaint house she had built for herself, her heart pounding in her chest. It had been 4 long years since Javier left without a trace. 4 years of sleepless nights, unanswered questions, and the void of uncertainty that had swallowed her whole. They had been married for only 2 years when he left, with the promise of returning from what was supposed to be a brief business trip. But the trip had extended into weeks, then months, and eventually, years. As the time passed, Michelle had received fewer and fewer calls from him until they stopped altogether. No explanation, no message, only silence. Today, out of the blue, she had received a call from Javier. He was back in town. After all this time, he hadn't given many details over the phone, but his voice sounded different, hollow, tired. Part of her wanted to run into his arms, ask him why he had left, beg him to never leave again. But another part of her was filled with fury, bitterness from the years of abandonment. She heard the low hum of a car pulling into the driveway and braced herself. The vehicle parked, and from it stepped a man she barely recognized. Javier had changed. His once vibrant energy seemed dulled, his eyes tired and older than the years that had passed. His expression was unreadable as he approached her, hesitant, almost as if he didn't know if he was welcome. "Michelle," he said softly, his voice strained with guilt. Michelle took in a deep breath. "Javier, where have you been?" she asked, her voice a mixture of sorrow and anger. Before he could answer, Michelle noticed someone else in the car. A woman, dark-haired and beautiful, with an air of confidence that immediately sent a chill down Michelle's spine. It was as if the ground beneath her was giving way, leaving her with nothing to stand on. "Who is she?" Michelle demanded, her eyes locked on Javier's. Javier glanced back at the woman, who was now stepping out of the car. "Michelle, this is Cassandra," he said softly, but his words hit Michelle like a ton of bricks. "We need to talk." The air inside the house was thick with tension as Javier and Michelle sat across from each other at the dining table. Cassandra lingered awkwardly in the background, but her presence felt suffocating to Michelle. She had so many questions, but she didn't know where to start. Michelle's voice trembled as she broke the silence. "4 years, Javier. 4 years and not a single word from you. And now you show up with her?" She shot a glance at Cassandra, who looked uncomfortable but remained silent. "I know I've hurt you," Javier said, his voice low and pained. "When I left for that business trip, I didn't expect things to get so complicated. But when I met Cassandra," he trailed off, guilt consuming his words. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Michelle. We, Cassandra and I, started working closely together and I made a mistake." Michelle's heart was racing. The anger she had tried to hold back was now bubbling to the surface. "A mistake," she repeated, her voice rising. "You left me, Javier. You disappeared without any explanation, without any word. And now you come back, after all these years, with another woman and expect me to understand." "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," Javier said quickly, his eyes pleading with her. "I know I don't deserve it. I don't even know why I'm here. I just couldn't stay away anymore." Michelle could feel her tears welling up, but she refused to let them fall. She had spent years crying over Javier's absence. Now, she wouldn't shed another tear for him. "You've destroyed everything we had," she whispered. As she said those words, Cassandra stepped forward, finally speaking up. "I know this is hard, but Javier and we didn't plan this. It just happened." Michelle snapped her gaze to Cassandra. "You didn't plan this," she said, her voice full of scorn. "You helped ruin my marriage. Do you even realize what you've done?" Cassandra averted her eyes, but Michelle knew she was hitting a nerve. Javier stayed at a hotel that night, leaving Michelle alone with her thoughts. As the hours passed, Michelle felt an array of emotions surge through her. Anger, sadness, betrayal, and disbelief. She had been a devoted wife, waiting patiently for Javier's return. She had never once doubted his love or his loyalty. And yet, here she was, abandoned and betrayed in the most painful way possible. She spent the next few days reflecting on their marriage, analyzing every moment they had shared. She wondered if there had been signs that she had missed, subtle clues that Javier had grown distant before he left, but she couldn't think of any. He had left her as a loving husband and returned as a stranger. But in her grief, Michelle also felt something new: resolve. She had waited long enough for Javier. He had made his choice when he left her for Cassandra. Now, it was her turn to take control of the situation. Michelle decided she wouldn't be a passive victim. She had lost 4 years of her life waiting for Javier, and she wasn't about to let him or Cassandra walk away unscathed. Over the next few weeks, Michelle put her plan into action. She knew that revenge wouldn't heal her broken heart, but it would give her some satisfaction. She wasn't just going to watch Javier walk away with Cassandra without consequences. She began gathering information, finding out everything she could about Cassandra, her business, her personal life, and her weaknesses. Michelle had always been resourceful, and she knew how to use what she found to her advantage. She learned that Cassandra had ambitions far beyond Javier. She was power-hungry, someone who would do whatever it took to climb the social and business ladder. But Cassandra had enemies, people she had crossed on her way up. Michelle discreetly reached out to some of those people, planting seeds of doubt about Cassandra's loyalty and integrity. It didn't take long for rumors to spread, undermining Cassandra's reputation in her business circles. Michelle made sure her involvement was kept hidden, playing the part of the wronged wife while silently dismantling Cassandra's world. Meanwhile, Michelle also began to regain control of her personal life. She focused on her work, on rebuilding her self-worth. She refused to let Javier's betrayal define her. She had spent too much time waiting for him to return. Now, she was going to live for herself. But she wasn't done with Javier yet. She still had feelings for him. Despite the betrayal, part of her wanted him to feel the full weight of his mistake. She wanted him to realize what he had thrown away when he left her. As Javier and Cassandra's relationship began to falter, thanks to Michelle's quiet interference, Javier started to realize that the grass wasn't greener on the other side. Cassandra's ambition, which had once been alluring, now seemed cold and calculating. He began to see the cracks in their relationship, the distance that had formed between them. He found himself thinking more and more about Michelle, about the life they had once shared, the love, the comfort, the simplicity of their bond. He had been a fool to walk away from it all. Michelle, knowing she had Javier's attention once again, played it cool. She acted as though she had moved on, living her life independently and without the need for him. This only made Javier more desperate to win her back. Weeks had passed since Javier's return, and the cracks between him and Cassandra were widening. Michelle, having quietly manipulated the situation, now observed with a mixture of satisfaction and emotional conflict. She had achieved what she had set out to do. Cassandra's once impenetrable confidence was crumbling, her reputation in tatters. Yet, the feeling of victory was bittersweet. Michelle had loved Javier once, and despite his betrayal, some part of her still ached for him. But she would not be swayed by her emotions. Not yet. Javier, oblivious to Michelle's behind-the-scenes maneuvers, had grown increasingly distant from Cassandra. The passionate relationship he had once thought of as a fresh start had soured. Cassandra's true nature was showing, her obsession with power, money, and status pushing them further apart. Arguments became frequent about business, trust, and their future. It was clear that Cassandra cared more about her public image than the relationship she had with Javier. One evening, as Javier and Cassandra sat across from each other at a dimly lit restaurant, their dinner devolved into another argument. Cassandra was fuming over a business deal that had fallen through, one that Michelle had carefully sabotaged. Her fingers clenched her wine glass tightly, her anger barely contained. "You don't understand, Javier," Cassandra hissed. "Do you know what this means for my reputation? I've worked too hard for this, and now it's slipping away because of some unknown enemies." Javier sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Cassandra, I've tried to help, but maybe this isn't about your reputation. Maybe you've been too focused on climbing the ladder, and you've lost sight of what's important." Cassandra's eyes narrowed. And what's that? You? Us? Her voice was dripping with sarcasm. Javier clenched his jaw, his patience thinning. No, Cassandra. It's about more than that. It's about how you treat people. You've alienated everyone around you, and you're too blinded by ambition to even see it. Cassandra scoffed. And you're one to talk? You left your wife without so much as a word and ran off with me. Don't pretend to be some kind of moral high ground now. Javier flinched at her words. He had tried to bury the guilt of leaving Michelle, but Cassandra's sharp remark cut deep. He had made a mistake, a monumental one. As much as he hated to admit it, he couldn't stop thinking about Michelle and the life they once had. The realization had been gnawing at him, growing stronger every day. While Javier and Cassandra's relationship disintegrated, Michelle's life took on a new trajectory. Freed from the emotional chains of waiting for Javier, she threw herself into her work and personal growth. Her career blossomed, and she built a strong network of friends and colleagues who admired her strength and resilience. The community she surrounded herself with became her support system, filling the void that Javier had left behind. But more than that, Michelle had reclaimed her sense of self-worth. The woman who had once been defined by her marriage now stood tall as an independent force, confident and in control of her destiny. Still, she couldn't ignore the fact that Javier had returned. His presence in her life was like an unresolved storm on the horizon, waiting to either pass or wreak havoc. Michelle knew it was only a matter of time before Javier would come crawling back, desperate for the stability and warmth she had once provided. She had spent too long preparing for this moment, preparing to face him, to make him truly understand the depth of her pain, and to show him what he had lost. She wasn't interested in revenge for the sake of it. She wanted Javier to regret his actions for the rest of his life. One evening, as Michelle sat in her living room, reflecting on everything that had transpired, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Javier standing there, looking weary and conflicted. "Michelle, can we talk?" he asked, his voice heavy with regret. Michelle stepped aside, letting him in. The air between them was tense, filled with unsaid words and emotions that had been buried for years. Javier sat down, nervously wringing his hands together. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," Javier began, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I left you. I abandoned everything we had. And for what? A fleeting moment of excitement with Cassandra. I was stupid and selfish." Michelle remained silent, her arms crossed as she watched him unravel. "I've been thinking about you, about us, ever since I came back," Javier continued. "Cassandra and we're not working. She's not the person I thought she was, and honestly, I'm not the person I thought I was. I can't stop thinking about what I lost when I left you." Michelle raised an eyebrow. "What you lost?" Javier looked up, his eyes pleading. "Yes, Michelle. You. Our life. Our love. I was too blind to see it back then, but I see it now. I want to fix things. I know it's a lot to ask, but I need you to understand how sorry I am." Michelle felt the weight of his words, but she wasn't moved. She had expected this moment, and she wasn't going to let him off the hook so easily. "Javier, do you really think you can just come back and everything will be okay? That I'll forget about the years I spent alone, wondering where you were, why you left, and if you were ever coming back?" "I don't expect you to forget," Javier said, his voice cracking. I just want a chance to make things right." As the days went by, Michelle agreed to meet with Javier again to discuss their past. Javier had grown more desperate, constantly reaching out to her, hoping to rekindle the love they once shared. But Michelle wasn't ready to make things easy for him. She invited him over for dinner one night, but with a twist, Cassandra would be there too. When Javier arrived at Michelle's house, he was shocked to see Cassandra sitting at the table. Tension filled the room as Michelle welcomed them both with a calm smile, though her eyes held a storm of emotion. "Why is she here?" Javier asked, his voice laced with confusion. Michelle shrugged. "I thought it was only fair. After all, we all have unfinished business, don't we?" Cassandra, who had been blindsided by the invitation, remained silent. She wasn't sure what game Michelle was playing, but she wasn't about to let herself be outmaneuvered. As the evening wore on, Michelle calmly laid out everything she had discovered about Cassandra's true nature, her shady dealings, and the manipulative tactics she had used to keep Javier hooked. Javier, now seeing Cassandra in a new light, felt a sickening realization wash over him. Michelle had orchestrated this entire situation to expose the cracks in their relationship, and it was working. "You're pathetic, Javier," Cassandra spat as the dinner grew increasingly heated. "You think running back to Michelle is going to fix everything? You're weak, always looking for someone to blame." Javier stood, unable to contain his frustration any longer. "Maybe I am weak, but at least I'm not like you, Cassandra. I wanted something real, something meaningful, but all you ever cared about was yourself." Michelle watched the exchange with an eerie calm, satisfied that both Javier and Cassandra were finally facing the consequences of their actions. But as much as she enjoyed watching them unravel, she knew it was time to bring this chapter of her life to a close. The fallout from that night was swift. Cassandra left town, her reputation irreparably damaged by the revelations Michelle had orchestrated. Javier, having burned every bridge, found himself alone and filled with regret. But Michelle was no longer interested in playing the part of the heartbroken wife, waiting for his return. She had built a life for herself, one filled with purpose and self-respect, and she wasn't about to let Javier back in so easily. Yet, as much as she wanted to walk away from him entirely, there was still a flicker of something between them, something she wasn't ready to extinguish just yet. Michelle agreed to meet with Javier one last time, not to forgive him but to discuss what their future might look like, whether as friends, partners, or something more. Javier, humbled by the experience, was willing to work for whatever Michelle was willing to give him. He knew now that his happiness didn't lie in fleeting excitement or superficial relationships, but in the depth of connection he had once shared with Michelle. "I'm not asking for everything to go back to how it was," Javier said quietly. "I just want to be part of your life again, in whatever way you'll allow." Michelle stared at him for a long moment before speaking. "We can start over, Javier, but this time, it's on my terms." With that, they took the first tentative steps toward rebuilding their relationship, not as the people they once were, but as two individuals who had grown through heartbreak, betrayal, and self-discovery. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but they were both ready to try. Weeks after the explosive dinner confrontation, Michelle found herself reflecting on the drastic changes in her life. Cassandra had disappeared from their town's social scene, her reputation in shambles. The community buzzed with rumors about the broken relationship between her and Javier. While Michelle had achieved her goal of exposing Cassandra's manipulative nature and making Javier regret his choices, she wasn't entirely satisfied. Revenge had brought her temporary relief, but the deeper emotional wounds still lingered. Michelle had decided that she wouldn't let her life revolve around Javier's return or the fall of Cassandra. She had spent 4 years becoming a better, stronger version of herself, and now she needed to live for herself. Even though she had allowed Javier back into her life, she remained cautious. The walls she had built over the years wouldn't crumble so easily. One evening, Michelle stood by her bedroom window, staring out at the city lights. She thought about the love she had once shared with Javier and how different they were now. Her feelings were complicated. She wasn't sure if they could ever rebuild what they had lost, but a part of her was curious. Could Javier really change, or was he still the man who had walked out on her years ago? The next morning, she decided to meet him, not to rekindle their relationship, but to set boundaries. She called Javier and suggested they meet at a local cafe. Javier, eager for any opportunity to see her, immediately agreed. When they sat across from each other, Michelle's demeanor was calm, collected. She looked him straight in the eyes and said, "Javier, I think we both need to be honest about what's happened. I'm not going to let you back into my life just because you regret your choices." Javier nodded, his expression serious. "I understand that, Michelle. I don't expect things to go back to how they were. I just want a chance to show you that I've changed, that I'm not the same person who hurt you." Michelle leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "But have you changed?" Or are you just desperate because things didn't work out with Cassandra?" Her words cut through him like a knife. Javier swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I've had a lot of time to think about what I did. And you're right, leaving you was the biggest mistake of my life. I was looking for something exciting, something different, but I didn't realize that I was throwing away the best thing I ever had." Michelle didn't respond immediately. She let his words hang in the air, observing his sincerity. She could see the regret in his eyes, but she wasn't ready to trust him just yet. "I'm not going to let you hurt me again," she said firmly. "If we're going to try to move forward, it's going to be on my terms." Javier nodded again, his voice softer this time. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes, Michelle." Over the following months, Michelle and Javier began a tentative journey toward rebuilding their relationship. It wasn't a romantic reunion. Michelle had made it clear that they needed to start as friends. They spent time together, but there were no grand gestures of love or passionate declarations. Instead, they worked on trust. Javier took every opportunity to prove himself. He showed up when he said he would. He listened to Michelle's concerns, and he respected her boundaries. For the first time in years, he wasn't focused on chasing excitement or ambition. He was focused on making things right with the woman he had wronged. But despite his efforts, Michelle still struggled with her feelings. Every time she looked at Javier, she was reminded of the pain he had caused her. The memories of those long, lonely nights haunted her. She had spent 4 years wondering what she had done wrong, questioning her worth, and now she wasn't sure if she could ever fully forgive him. One afternoon, as they walked through a park together, Michelle stopped suddenly and turned to Javier. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been if you hadn't left?" she asked quietly. Javier sighed, his face filled with regret. "Every day, Michelle. I think about it every single day." Michelle looked away, her eyes scanning the trees in the distance. "I want to believe you, Javier, but it's hard. I gave you everything, and you threw it away like it meant nothing." Javier reached out to touch her arm, but she stepped back, keeping her distance. "I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me easily, but I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere this time." They stood in silence for a moment before Michelle finally spoke again. "I need more time. I need to see that this isn't just another phase for you." Javier nodded, understanding. "Take all the time you need." While Javier was working to regain Michelle's trust, Cassandra was quietly plotting her return. She had been humiliated and exiled from her high society circles, and she blamed Michelle for her downfall. In Cassandra's mind, Michelle was the reason Javier had abandoned her, and she wanted revenge. Cassandra started spreading rumors about Michelle, trying to tarnish her reputation. She reached out to mutual acquaintances, whispering lies about Michelle's character and her motivations. She painted herself as the victim, claiming that Michelle had stolen Javier away from her. At first, Michelle wasn't aware of Cassandra's schemes. She was too focused on her own healing and her slow reconciliation with Javier. But soon, the rumors started reaching her, and she realized that Cassandra wasn't going to disappear quietly. Rather than confront Cassandra directly, Michelle decided to take a different approach. She had learned a lot in the past few years about power and influence, and she wasn't the same naive woman she had been when Javier left her. She knew how to protect herself and how to dismantle Cassandra's plans. Michelle began to quietly gather information on Cassandra's business dealings, uncovering unethical practices that could ruin her. With the help of her network, she exposed Cassandra's illegal activities to the authorities and the media. Within weeks, Cassandra's remaining credibility was destroyed, and she was forced to leave the city in disgrace. But Michelle didn't stop there. She wanted to ensure that Cassandra would never again have the opportunity to hurt anyone else. She filed a lawsuit against her for defamation, using the rumors Cassandra had spread as evidence of her malicious intent. The legal battle dragged on for months, but in the end, Michelle won, securing a restraining order against Cassandra and forcing her to pay a hefty settlement. Cassandra's defeat was total, and Michelle felt a sense of closure. She hadn't sought revenge out of anger or spite. She had done it to protect herself and ensure that Cassandra could never hurt her or anyone else again. With Cassandra out of the picture, Michelle's focus shifted back to her relationship with Javier. They had been slowly rebuilding trust, but there was still a long way to go. Michelle wasn't sure if she could ever fully forgive him for what he had done, but she was willing to try. One evening, Javier invited Michelle over to his apartment for dinner. It was a simple gesture, but it was meaningful. This was the first time they had spent time together in a private setting since his return. As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed easily. For the first time in years, they were able to talk openly, without the weight of the past hanging over them. They talked about their hopes, their dreams, and the lives they had built during their time apart. After dinner, as they sat on the couch with glasses of wine, Javier turned to Michelle, his expression serious. "Michelle, I know I've said it before, but I need to say it again. I'm so sorry for everything I did. I know I can never take back the pain I caused you, but I want to spend the rest of my life making it up to you." Michelle looked at him, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. She had spent so long guarding herself against him, but now, in this moment, she could see the sincerity in his eyes. He wasn't the same man who had walked out on her years ago. He had grown, just as she had. "I've forgiven you, Javier," Michelle said softly, "but that doesn't mean everything will go back to how it was. We've both changed, and if we're going to move forward, it has to be as the people we are now, not who we were then." Javier nodded, understanding. "I know. I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Michelle smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Then let's take it one step at a time." And so, they began to rebuild. Not as the broken couple they had once been, but as two people who had learned from their mistakes and were willing to try again. As Michelle and Javier began their cautious journey towards reconciliation, the weight of their shared history remained ever present. Every conversation, every glance, held the memory of what had once been, and the shadow of what had torn them apart. Michelle, although slowly letting Javier back into her life, still held tightly onto her independence, a hard-won part of her life that she wasn't willing to sacrifice again. But there was an undercurrent of tension neither of them could ignore. Michelle knew that if they were going to truly move forward, they would need to confront the past head-on. Not just the fact that Javier had left, but also the reasons why. There were still unanswered questions, wounds that had never fully healed. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Michelle sat alone in her apartment. The quiet was suffocating, the silence filled with the echoes of memories that refused to fade. She thought about the life she had built after Javier left, how she had clawed her way back from heartbreak, transforming herself into the confident, successful woman she was today. But despite her strength, the ache in her heart had never fully disappeared. That night, Michelle decided it was time. She couldn't keep dancing around the past forever. If she and Javier were going to have any chance at a future, they needed to face the truth. With her resolve firm, she called Javier, her voice steady as she asked him to meet her at her apartment the next day. Javier arrived promptly, as he always did now, respecting the boundaries Michelle had set. His eyes held a flicker of concern when he saw the serious expression on her face. "Michelle, is everything okay?" Michelle gestured for him to sit on the couch across from her, maintaining a distance that had become their norm. She wasn't ready to let him too close, not yet. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice calm but firm, "about us, about what happened." Javier's face tightened slightly, as if he had been expecting this moment, but still wasn't fully prepared for it. "I understand." "No," Michelle said quickly, cutting him off. "I don't think you do, Javier. I don't think we've really talked about it, about why you left." Javier sighed, rubbing his hands together nervously. "I know I've apologized, Michelle. I know what I did was unforgivable. But I'm not asking for another apology," Michelle interrupted. Her voice was soft but insistent. "I need to understand why you left, why you didn't fight for us, for me." Javier's eyes darkened with the weight of his guilt. He had thought about this moment so many times, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure how to explain himself. He had been a different person back then. Selfish, reckless, constantly seeking excitement in places he should never have gone. I was scared, he finally admitted, his voice raw with vulnerability. Scared of what we had. Scared of how perfect it all seemed. I thought I would ruin it, that I wasn't good enough for you. So instead of staying and trying to be better, I ran. I looked for something easier, something that wouldn't require me to face my own flaws. Michelle listened, her expression unreadable, but inside, her heart was breaking all over again. It wasn't just that Javier had left. It was that he had doubted their love, doubted her. I spent 4 years wondering what I did wrong, she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes, wondering why I wasn't enough for you. Javier's heart clenched at her words, the guilt overwhelming him. He reached out, desperate to hold her, to comfort her, but Michelle stood up, stepping away from him. You hurt me more than I thought was possible, she continued, her voice shaking, and I had to rebuild myself from nothing. I had to learn to live without you, to be strong on my own. And now you're back, and I don't know how to trust you again. Javier stood up too, his eyes filled with regret. Michelle, I'm so sorry. I know I can never undo the pain I caused, but I swear to you, I've changed. I'm not that scared, selfish man anymore. I want to be the man you deserve, the man who will never run again. Michelle looked at him, her heart torn between the love she still felt for him and the fear of being hurt again. She wanted to believe him, but she didn't know if she could. Could she risk her heart again? Could she let herself love him, knowing how much it had cost her the first time? I don't know if I can ever fully trust you again, she said quietly, but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to see if we can rebuild, piece by piece. Javier nodded, his voice thick with emotion. That's all I'm asking for, Michelle. A chance to prove that I'm worthy of your love. Just as Michelle and Javier began to cautiously rebuild their relationship, an unexpected complication arose. One day, Michelle received an ornate envelope in the mail, a wedding invitation. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the names on the invitation: Cassandra and her new fiancé. It seemed that despite her downfall, Cassandra had managed to move on quickly, finding a wealthy man to marry and secure her place back in high society. The wedding was set to be a grand event, and Michelle's name was on the guest list. Javier noticed Michelle's tension as she stared at the invitation, her knuckles white as she gripped the envelope. What is it? He asked, concerned. It's from Cassandra, Michelle said, her voice bitter. She's getting married. Javier's face darkened at the mention of Cassandra, the woman who had caused so much pain between them. Why would she invite you? Michelle laughed humorlessly. Because she wants to rub it in my face. She thinks she's won. Javier frowned. You don't have to go, Michelle. You don't owe her anything. But Michelle's eyes narrowed, a spark of defiance in them. No, I think I will go. I want her to see that she didn't break me. That no matter how hard she tried, I'm still standing. Javier's expression softened. He admired Michelle's strength, her determination to rise above everything that had been thrown at her. I'll go with you, he said quietly. Michelle looked at him, surprised. You don't have to do that. I want to, Javier insisted. I want to be by your side, no matter what. And so, on the day of the wedding, Michelle and Javier arrived together, their presence causing a stir among the guests. Cassandra had expected Michelle to come alone, perhaps broken and defeated, but instead, she arrived with Javier, standing tall and confident. As they entered the grand ballroom, all eyes were on them. Michelle could feel the weight of the stairs, but she didn't flinch. She had come a long way from the woman she had once been, and she wasn't going to let anyone, not even Cassandra, make her feel small. Cassandra approached them with a sly smile, her fiancé trailing behind her. Michelle, Javier, she greeted them, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I'm so glad you could make it. Michelle smiled back, her voice cool and composed. We wouldn't miss it for the world, Cassandra. The tension between the two women was palpable, but Michelle refused to be drawn into any more of Cassandra's games. She had won, not by tearing Cassandra down, but by rising above the pettiness and reclaiming her own life. As the evening wore on, Michelle and Javier stayed close, supporting each other through the awkward interactions and whispered gossip. For the first time in years, they felt like a team again, facing the world together. Later that night, as they left the wedding and walked down the steps of the grand venue, Michelle looked over at Javier. "Thank you for coming with me." Javier smiled softly. "I told you, I'll always be by your side." Michelle's heart swelled with emotion. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance at something new, something better. And as they walked into the night, hand in hand, Michelle knew that whatever the future held, she was ready for it. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more delightful stories.